Okay, let's run you through some of the important events that led the English language to where it is today. And I'm going to walk you through sort of the early stuff, and I'm going to call this series Invasions and Inventions because you've got some key invasions and one key invention in particular that we're going to talk about that sort of get us from Old English through to the beginnings of modern English. So let's start with some invasions. The island that we call Great Britain these days, before about 400 CE, 400 AD, in other words, was mostly inhabited by Celtic people. So the kind of people that still are there today and speak languages like Welsh and Gaelic and Cornish and things like that. They were there and they moved in, many centuries before the people who became the English. And then also for a while there, the Romans took over England and ruled it as a province of the Roman Empire called Britannia. So we had the Celts. At some point, things like Stonehenge were built. No one's 100% sure if it was the Celts or if it was someone else entirely, maybe. As far as I know, they haven't completely confirmed who built it. And then there were also the Romans, as I said. Now, the funny thing is that the Romans, they ruled the place as a colony for about 400 years, but mostly the regular people there just stayed the Celts, and they kept speaking their Celtic dialects that they'd been speaking there already. And the Romans at that point didn't leave much of the Latin language behind when they left. But a group that did have a massive impact on the language are the people that came after. So from about 500 CE onwards, or slightly before that even, there were waves of invasions and colonization from people who came from parts of England that are sort of now northern Germany, the northern Netherlands and Denmark and stuff. And these people are called the Anglo-Saxons, or it's actually three groups, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who are from different areas around there they kind of came together to make this group of people called the Anglo-Saxons. And they spoke various Germanic dialects, West Germanic dialects that are sort of related to things like Dutch and Frisian and German that are still spoken today. And their dialects, if you sort of mash them together, became what we call Old English. So it's with these people that the language we are speaking today actually began. So that's kind of the key point there. And you can look at a map. They had all these little kingdoms all around England. All of those red ones are kingdoms that were ruled by Angles, and then you got the brown ones that my face is hiding there down the bottom with the Saxons. And then over on the left-hand side of the map, places like Wales and Cornwall and things like that, you've got all these Celtic kingdoms that still held on there. So that's about 500, where all of these Anglo-Saxons are coming in from the east, from the continent of Europe, and invading the place. So that's our first invasion, is the Anglo-Saxons come into England, basically take over what is modern England, bringing their Germanic language with them, and that's Old English. That is where our language starts. Then, next invasion that we need to know about was in 1066. After a couple of, about 500 years of the Anglo-Saxons running the joint with their various little Anglo-Saxon kingdoms speaking Germanic languages, suddenly there's an attack. This is a picture from the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a big tapestry that shows this war, like the Battle of Hastings and all that, where the Norman French attack England and take over. It says there in Latin, hic exeunt cabali, which just means here the horses exit, because they brought in all their soldiers and horses and they took over. Their leader was called William the Conqueror. Conquered London, became king. They were Normans. The Normans were from the north of France, a place called Normandy, and they spoke a version of French, a historical version of French, which is just called Norman French. And so they were running the place. So all of the court system, all the legal stuff was being done in Norman French. All of the administration was being done in Norman French. The regular people, though, remained these Anglo-Saxon peasants who were speaking a Germanic language that was Old English at the time. So to summarize all that, you've got a situation where the rulers are speaking Norman French. The peasants are still speaking Old English, but you have interaction between the two of them because the peasants will sometimes need to talk to their Norman French overlords, and the Norman French overlords might be trying to communicate with the peasants. And the interaction between the two of them changed the English language that the peasants were speaking because they were absorbing more and more French vocabulary from the rulers. It became Middle English. So this Norman invasion completely disrupted their language. And this is where Old English turns into Middle English, and lots of French gets dropped on top of it. From this era, we can start reading texts written in this era and sort of understand them. If we try to read a text written in Old English nowadays, unless you've actually studied Old English, you won't be able to understand very much at all because Old English is so different from Modern English. But Middle English, as a Modern English speaker, you can sort of follow it. This is from the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. As a Modern English speaker, you can vaguely follow it. You can understand quite a lot of it because Middle English is where it starts getting much closer to what we speak today. So, big change. French come in, boom, lots and lots of French vocabulary gets dropped on top of English. Completely disrupts things. So around 1300, so this is a couple of hundred years after the Normans invade in 1066, you've got a map of England with dialects that sort of look like this. You'll notice, though, all the coloured bits are speaking various forms of Middle English, like different local dialects. But you'll notice that, for example, Wales is white, Cornwall down the bottom left there is white, and then a lot of Scotland, particularly the Highlands up the top there, are also in white. They weren't speaking English then. They were still speaking these Celtic languages. So right up to, the 1300s, 1400s, English was still really only spoken in England. Even places like Wales, the English language had not really penetrated very much. Now, what would happen, because as we just talked about, the rulers were speaking Norman French and the regular peasants were speaking Anglo-Saxon Old English when the Norman French came in, the language started changing in a way that basically the regular everyday stuff kept on being Germanic. But the administrative and legal stuff, they would use Norman French words. So your average English peasant, for all of the everyday normal stuff, they'd keep using the Germanic words they'd use forever, but they'd use French words for anything that was to do with the government or to do with the courts, and sometimes even just anything they wanted to sound fancy. And so here's some things that happened, because we have all the historical echoes of this in modern English. So, for example, words that we still have in modern English that are from Old English, like from the Anglo-Saxons and how they spoke, we have words like wood, house, worthy, and eat. But then we also have a word that means the same thing, but that we got from Norman French, and that would be forest or mansion or valuable or dine. So all of those words sound a little bit fancier, a little bit more high class than the original Germanic ones, because the Norman French speakers were the people in charge. So their vocabulary became more prestigious. And so in modern English, a house is a regular house. A mansion is a big fancy house. If you learn French, maison in French just is the regular word for house. But in English, because we kind of put French words on a bit of a pedestal, partly for this historical reason, that happens. And the other thing, the example that everyone gives when they talk about Middle English and they talk about the Norman French influence is, for example, we have words in modern English that are Anglo-Saxon Germanic roots, such as pig, sheep, and cow. But we also have the Norman French versions of them, pork, beef, pork, mutton, did the wrong order, and beef. So we use the original Germanic word for the animal, but we use the French word, or the Norman French word, for the meat. Because meat was something that you tended to have to be wealthy to be eating a lot of meat. So the Anglo-Saxons would, have their pig and they'd chop it up and they'd give it to the rulers, and they say, here is your pork, using the French word for the animal to represent the meat. So this kind of thing happens a lot in modern English. You got all these words for the meat that we use the French word for, where even though we use the Germanic original word for the animal. And like I said, the governance was done in French, and that means that all of this Norman French legal and government vocabulary was dumped on top of English, and it's still there today. So words like court and judge and jury and parliament, they all started to enter the English language around this time because all of the government stuff was being done in Norman French. And another obvious one is straight up government. Okay, we'll pause it there. There'll be another video on how we get from Middle English to Modern English tomorrow.